are literally shaping the planet.
Purpose is the only pathway to a regenerative future.
We have a choice to stay with the status quo or to change.
What is the point of trying to be just resilient when we can actually innovate?
Thank you so much. I don't normally bring my dog with me to presentations, but she is being a little demanding today and has decided that the only place for her is right in my lap in front of my computer. So I apologize for the unexpected co-presenter. If it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides over here, but I just need, if you don't mind, sharing permission with me to do that. And folks, I am keeping an eye on the Q&A. So if you have any questions as we're going through some of the material, please, let's keep it informal. Go ahead and drop your question in there. But as KP mentioned, I'm on Shadow Slack channel. So I'll keep a lookout for any comments or questions there as well. As Anastasia mentioned, here we go. Thank you so much. My talk today is focused on rethinking the economy for the post-pandemic age. And there's a lot that goes into this. I think, for all of us, whether we're in real estate or in any other asset class, we know that we're engaged in a very robust but also highly speculative conversation around what the world might look like in the post-pandemic, what we certainly hope will be a post-pandemic world. And in the office sector, that manifests as a conversation around around whether or not people will ever go back into the office. When we're talking about cities, folks are talking about whether or not this sort of signals distance, and our ability to work from home and work remotely signals the death of cities, or whether we will revert to something that looks like a pre-pandemic norm. A lot of that conversation, particularly in the press, really gravitates towards the extremes, as if we were all going to leave the city, or everyone who had the economic capacity to leave the city would be doing so. But on the other extreme, that nothing would change at all. And I think sort of a reasonable set of assumptions for us are going to take into account the fact that there's a tremendous degree of uncertainty around these outcomes, but that whatever the outcome is, it's unlikely to be one of these polar opposites, that there's some element of remote working that enables us to locate as households across a broader geographic area than would be the case if we were going into the office absolutely every single day. For myself, I'm in New York City. And for all of my other colleagues in New York, in many cases, we choose to locate in Manhattan or Brooklyn or Queens or some other part of the city because the commuting time, even if not the distance, the commuting time, can be very, very long. And going into the office 5 days a week, there's only so much of a commute I can tolerate. But if I'm going in 3 days a week, all of a sudden, that may open up a wider range of possibilities for me. I'm willing to live in Westchester or in New Jersey or in Connecticut and make that 1 hour, 1.5 hour commute, not 5 days a week, 3 days a week. Sure, that's a reasonable trade-off if it also gives me access to more space, to better quality public schools. And so what I think we end up seeing is not people abandoning cities entirely, but some balance, where we are open to a wider range of geographies, a wider geographic radius, because of the fact that we have more flexibility about how we think about when we leverage the office. If the goal of going into the city, of going into the office, of meeting with colleagues, whether we work with them, whether they're clients, partners, vendors, a more judicious approach to that as we begin to think about, okay, for this particular engagement, whether it's formal or informal, is it something that I can do over Zoom? Is it something that I can do over Slack? Or is it something where there is real return on the investment of time and energy in being physically co-located? And we'll make, I think, much more careful and informed choices about when and where it is that we choose to co-locate. Whereas the default has been, we go in, or we fly to San Francisco, or we go down to DC. A newer sort of set of critical thinking around when we gather in person is one that's going to be based on just not a default, oh, let's of course be in the office every day, but what are the tasks and functions where being physically co-located are well served and where we generate additional returns on the investment of time and commuting or anything else, and what are the tasks and functions that I perform where I can actually do it more efficiently from being on my own, at home or at another location. And I think what we're going to see is that will lead to a different balance that does not exclude or negate or downplay or undervalue the very, very real returns from being physically co-located in terms of that spontaneous idea generation. So let me just open up one of my chats here, make sure that, just making sure the messages are coming in. Again, I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A. I've got, a deck of 40 slides. I'm going to get through maybe 5 or 6, but please feel free to connect offline, or I'll touch base with KP and the Shadow team. If there are no objections, I'll post some of this material to the channel as well. So marginal added incentive to make sure that you get on Shadow Slack channel. What I want to start with is, and what I'm largely going to skip is all of the charts that have, the data. I mean, you can pick up the Wall Street Journal, or Bloomberg or any other source and see a range of different, data sources. Some of the data that we've got is proprietary, so I will make sure that makes its way to you. But I want to actually talk in a broader, higher level sense about some of the things that are really driving the way that we're thinking about this. Because there is so much speculation around what the economy globally in the United States, what real estate will look like in a post-pandemic world, that we do need to put some kind of analytical framework around that thinking. So much of the dialogue is lacking in discipline that it's no surprise that we're just as far apart in our range of views as we were 3 or 4 months ago. So the first is that in terms of economic models, what are the key additional things that you would not see in a traditional economic model that are clearly playing an important role in our thinking about what the next few months will look like, what the next few quarters will look like? The first is that economists generally are talking to other economists, to people in business, looking at measures of sentiment as well as more objective data measures of activity in the economy to inform and calibrate their models. What is absolutely a key difference now is that we are more engaged with epidemiologists in conversations around what they see as the trajectory of the virus as an underpinning of all of our economic models. Anyone making projections about real estate, about the economy, that is not allowing his or her models to be deeply informed by a set of epidemiological assumptions is missing the point of what is happening in the world today and what has been happening for the last 6 to 8 months. So the first set of inputs that we would not normally see in an economic model relate to assumptions about the trajectory of the virus. And probably the key thing there is that we can easily observe that we're in very different places in different parts of the world. I have a campus in Shanghai, and our students there, our faculty there, are in a very different place than the faculty and students in New York City, because China, quite frankly, is in a very different place in terms of its ability to and how well it has contained the spread of the virus, the positivity rate on testing, the nature of their contact tracing regime is much more robust than what we have in the United States. I am not in any way making political statements and comparing the two economies. But suffice it to say that they are in a very different place in terms of the life cycle of the virus and their management of the virus. And that is, it's a key factor for us, because at the other extreme, we can look at a country like India, where not only do virus numbers continue to rise, but the capacity of the underlying infrastructure and healthcare system to actually manage a pandemic is much more limited than what we have in either China or the United States. What we also know is that as we move to relax many of the restrictions that have been placed on us by government, many of the restrictions, and this is key, that households have placed upon themselves in terms of the behaviors that we engage in. We can reopen restaurants, we can reopen movie theaters. We have to, as a secondary thing, then observe, do people actually go and are they active agents and participants in the economy? And what we see is that people, while we can sort of see on the news, very dramatic, sometimes troubling images of large numbers of people gathering on beaches, or maybe a month ago on the beach, certainly here in upstate New York, where it's about 30 degrees this morning, not the beach any longer, but large numbers of people gathering in ways that might sort of belie that we are still in a pandemic. But those as those assumptions are relaxed, what's also clear, and we can see in different parts of the United States, we can certainly see in Europe, today in the UK and Germany and Spain and France, rising numbers of cases. And I think what that reflects is that there's going to be a nonlinear some nonlinearity to the progress we make in tackling the virus. In late March, early April, we can be forgiven that we took, from a policy perspective, very, very blunt approaches to shutting down the economy. And we'll see that in the economic numbers, how very abrupt and deep the deterioration in economic activity was because of the self-imposed constraints that we placed upon ourselves. And I think we can be forgiven that, because if you were to go back to late March and April, what's clear as compared to today is that our understanding of the virus and how to tackle it, has evolved tremendously over this period. Something as basic as our guidance around whether or not to wear masks. The directives were very, very clear, from the medical community, that you should only be wearing a mask if you were a frontline health worker, if you were in an IC unit, but for the general public, it was absolutely not recommended. And a very, very different set of guidance today, where you're likely to face a fine. And certainly in New York City, public shaming if you were to board a subway or walk into an office building or any other enclosed space without a mask on. Talking to colleagues and family that are in the medical profession, the other thing that's very clear is that in the way that we were thinking about intubation and the medical treatments, we were very, very early in March and April in terms of our understanding around what kinds of treatments might actually be effective. As we move forward, we can be more precise and targeted and surgical in the kinds of economic and behavioral interventions that we introduce to the economy. The only economy thus far where we've seen a broad reversal of activity and the kind of reimposition of national closures and stoppages of activity, the likes of which we saw in March and April, so far has been in Israel, where on a per capita basis, the case numbers have risen fairly dramatically over the last couple of weeks, and regrettably, the timing of the reimposition of these constraints on activity coinciding with the high holidays. But wherever we are in the world, the fact that we have learned a lot more means that we can be more precise and strategic. We're not just going to shut everything down. And you can see that in language from the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson over the last just 24 hours around what kinds of new measures might be reintroduced in the UK as their virus numbers very, very clearly begin to rise. The other element of these epidemiological assumptions, of course, relates to a real unknown and a great deal of speculation around what health outcomes will be when we have a coincidence of both the virus and the flu. And these are very different, of course, but what our medical colleagues are telling us is that it remains to be seen what the flu season looks like. On one hand, the fact that we're wearing masks, we're washing hands, we're out, being much more distant from one another, that in itself, while those are measures that are in place to limit the spread of the virus, they are also invariably things that will limit the spread of the flu. But at the same time, there's concern around whether or not we will see as high a degree of vaccination as we would observe during a normal flu season, and what the dominant strains of the flu will be this particular year. Where that feeds off of itself then is concerns, and this is an unknown for us right now, around what the health outcomes will be, what the mortality rates will be for someone who potentially gets the flu and COVID at the same time. And again, I'm an economist, not a medical professional, so these elements of our economic models are really being informed by input from our colleagues that we're in regular dialogue with, but the potential for us to experience or observe a significantly higher rate of mortality amongst relatively young people that, for the most part, have seen better health outcomes than older segments of the population. That there's a great deal of vulnerability there if they were actually to have both of these at the same time. The second set of assumptions for the economic models relates to policy. And I see someone has their hand up. If you don't mind, go ahead and use the Q&A because I'm keeping an eye on that, and I'll make sure to come back to it. The second set of assumptions around policy interventions at the federal, state, and local level. At the local level, everything from what kind of limits in different cities are we seeing on activity as consumers, but also how are different local governments addressing, what amounts to, in places like New York, Chicago, Detroit, Boston, ultimately nothing short of a fiscal crisis. And we see this, in California, the potential, sort of the pandemic having motivated, there's some momentum around the repeal of Prop 13 that could see a significant rise in commercial property taxes. State and local governments around the country are on the verge of the most significant and far-reaching fiscal crisis that many of us will have seen in our lifetimes. For students of the Philadelphia fiscal crisis, the Detroit fiscal crisis, the New York fiscal crisis, which happened earlier, obviously, this could be devastating to the competitiveness of different economies. As a real estate person, I'm looking at this from the perspective of, how does New York compete if we cannot fund a subway system in a way that has high capacity and low congestion? How is it that we compete for businesses, for people, if we raise either commercial or personal local income taxes? These are very, very real issues for us at a time when, on balance, high congestion, high density cities, and we can debate whether or not it's informed by science or not, are relatively out of favor. At the federal level, the kinds of policy sort of assumptions we're making are about whether or not we'll see sort of a reinstatement or a reinvigoration of some of the federal policy, the fiscal interventions that are designed to help small businesses, that are designed to help the unemployed. That the data clearly tells us, while we've seen a lot of people go back to work, we have clearly not seen a lot of net new jobs being created in the economy. And the prospect of long-term disengagement from the labor force in the United States economy is, again, one of those things that requires some radical rethinking around how it is that business responds, but also how policymakers respond. The last of these economic model assumptions, sorry. Hey, puppy. It relates to behavioral assumptions, and in particular as it relates to consumer and household activity. So although the opportunity for us to re-engage in the economy presents itself when we look around the world, notwithstanding sort of the nightly news images of large gatherings of people raising concerns, what the data clearly tells us, we're tracking data from Google and Apple and mapping and Open Table, you name it. We're looking at any kind of high frequency data we can get our hands on. What's very, very clear is that although the opportunity to re-engage has improved, the median American household is not the image you're seeing on television. You can see this in the TSA data as well. We've seen a significant improvement in the number of people who are traveling again, but and even with the reduced capacity on any given plane, on a Delta flight or any of the other airlines, airlines are not hitting those capacity numbers. So our re-engagement in terms as economic agents is below the potential or the capacity of the economy. And the data from China and other economies that are further along in the life cycle of the virus tells us that this will actually persist for some time. The next set of things that we're looking at that are a little bit longer term, not a month from now, but really over the next couple of quarters and what we see happening in 2021. 3 healthcare scenarios that we need to be thinking about and that we're modeling. So again, far too much of the conversation is dominated by deterministic assessments. Someone saying we'll have a vaccine in a month, or someone saying we'll have a vaccine in 6 months. And I don't mean this just in the political setting, but we need to adopt a far more probabilistic mindset, where we're looking at different potential outcomes and thinking about the as best as possible, the likelihood that we'll see any of these different things. We are going to make missteps as business leaders, as policymakers, if we stick rigidly to some ideological view of this will be the particular outcome that we'll see. When the environment is characterized by a tremendous degree of uncertainty. So the 3 scenarios that we're looking at then, and this will be incredibly determinative of what 2021 will look like. The first healthcare scenario is one where we have a highly effective vaccine, that it also is characterized by a high degree of adoption. So what we mean by this is you can imagine a world in which you can get a smallpox vaccine, and that's highly effective in protecting you. And the effect, the longevity of the vaccine, is a lifetime. So you get the shot and you're in great shape. On the other hand, you can get something like the flu vaccine, which looks quite different. The duration and longevity of this vaccine, is on the order of months, not years. And the effectiveness, it might protect 50 to 60% of the people. Let me sort of rephrase it. It might reduce the number of cases that we observe by 50 to 60%. That would be a low effective, a vaccine that is low in its effectiveness, but reasonably high in terms of adoption. We've gotten into the habit of doing it. So you could imagine sort of this one scenario, a highly effective vaccine, that we get for COVID-19. It really works well. It protects 90% of people from getting COVID, and the adoption rate is also very, very high. Second scenario, a highly effective vaccine, but one that is low to moderate in its adoption. And there are a couple of different reasons why this might be the case. The key one is going to be issues around the distribution and logistics of actually getting the vaccine to people. When we talk about sort of a highly effective vaccine and broad immunization, that is something that even if we deployed our resources in a global vaccine campaign, the likes of which we've never seen, could take in some corners of the world until 2024. By the World Health Organization's estimates. The other, in a more developed economy like the United States, there is also an element of risk perception. I am not offering a commentary on the risks of getting vaccinated. But what I will say is that we know that there are, from the attitudinal data and from the historical patterns of behavior, that there are some segments of the population that will decline to get vaccinated if it is voluntary. We also know that in the current environment, it is highly unlikely that the vaccine, from a public policy perspective, will be anything other than voluntary. Your company, your educational institution may require that you get it, but it's unlikely that we're going to see a federal mandate that you get it. The other element of this is that because of the nature of the political discourse in the economy right now, because the timing of the vaccine is something that has entered into the political discourse, there is a significant share of the population that has some lingering concern around the possibility that it may be rushed through the process. And so when we look at the attitudinal surveys, the most recent ones, is something like 60 to 70% of the population said that when a vaccine becomes available, they're not going to be first to get it. And you could imagine sort of an off-the-cuff remark that someone might make, I'm going to wait for KP to get it, and I'm going to see if he turns green, and then I'll get it. But some concern around the risk profile of this thing, given the process, the potential for some kind of political pressure. And interestingly, what we see in that data is that that concern and the desire to perhaps wait and be second in line, not first to get the vaccine, is something that crosses sort of the political spectrum. The third scenario that we're looking at is one that is a moderately effective vaccine that might protect 50 to 60% of people. Then whether or not the adoption is high or low, doesn't affect sort of the outcomes in our economic modeling. Some degree of social distancing remains the norm, unless we are actually in the first of these three scenarios. We need a highly effective vaccine and a lot of people to get it. Otherwise, whether we think individually that it's right or wrong, some element of social distancing is going to act as a constraint on economic activity, and some types of economic activity, more than others. So what are those long-term economic scenarios that we're looking at? We're looking at three hypotheses, and again, these are longer term, but being informed by those healthcare scenarios, those vaccine scenarios that I talked about. And I can't stress enough, in an environment characterized by uncertainty, the lack of discipline in some of the discourse around what the future might look like, the degree of speculation that is not informed by some kind of analytical framework, we're doing ourselves a disservice. So what are some of these long-term economic scenarios? The first is and there are three hypotheses that we're looking at. There are other, there are many, many different scenarios, but these are the three, I would say, dominant hypotheses. The first is a reversion hypothesis. And I have to say at the outset, this is one that we see as low probability. But in the reversion hypothesis, we experience a significant and dramatic return to pre-pandemic patterns of behavior and business processes. So things just go back to the way they were. We would be doing everyone a disservice if we did not model these scenarios. even though we don't think it's likely. Second hypothesis, what we refer to as the acceleration hypothesis. In the acceleration hypothesis, we have a persistence of the trends that have been accelerated by the pandemic. So you'll hear a lot of folks talk about how, all of the things that we're seeing happen now are an acceleration of trends that, at a slower pace, were already, a feature of the economy and of business activity and of the way that we just engage. And that's probably what you hear most often, whether it's online shopping, whether it's remote working. Your trends are already in a very slow way percolating through the economy that have been accelerated out of necessity. We've had to learn how to work remotely, whether we've been skeptics of it or not. So some of those trends that have been accelerated by the pandemic exhibiting a real degree of persistence. So that there's working from home, remote working continues to play some significant role even after we have an effective vaccine against the pandemic. The third hypothesis is referred to as the inflection hypothesis, new and persistent changes to behaviors. So this is not just a scenario where we have an acceleration of underlying trends that persist, but there are actual new behaviors that emerge from the pandemic that we had not observed previously and that exhibit that persistence. And some of that will be the result of innovation, new innovations, to processes, breaking of legacy processes that we had not, that were motivated by our thinking about how we respond to the pandemic. And so that will be sort of a significant, that's again sort of a potentially significant scenario that we have to model. The rest of these slides I'm going to share with you, unfortunately, I've run out of time, and it's everything from the federal level to what we see as the long-term outlook for the way in which different local economies function. And if you're in real estate, on either side of this, what that means for different markets you're investing in, or, is there a geographic element to the way in which you think about bringing the innovation that has captured KP's attention to the table? There may be a greater opportunity for your innovation in Las Vegas or New Orleans than there is in New York City or Washington, D.C. right now, depending on what it is that is actually motivating the differences in the risk profile and the business recovery profiles in these different markets. So again, there's a lot here. Have really only touched the surface on some of what's going on and some of what's going to, in my view, sort of shape the long-term outlook for the for the performance of the economy. Ways in which we've got to be really, really smart. I'm a big believer in New York. I'm a big believer in the United States economy. But at the end of the day, there are also segments of our economy where we have much more limited degrees of freedom to make errors in charting our path forward. There are segments of the labor force that are going to have to retool and reskill if they have any, if they want to maximize the probability of their being able to re-engage as productive economic agents. Not everyone has had the luxury that all of us have had of being able to pick up our laptops, go home, and be productive, contributing members of the economy again. That kind of displacement can lead to significant increases in structural unemployment that we've really got to be paying attention to at every level. So I apologize I've not had a chance to do anything more than scratch the surface with this and providing that analytical framework for some of our thinking, but I don't want to impinge on the schedule, and so I will turn it back to Anastasia and to KP. Thank you to everyone at Shadow for including me in the program.